In the previous modules for this course, you learned about how books were produced and information was circulated in the medieval and ancient world. Creating a book was a laborious process that required a great investment of time and materials, and because of that, books and the information they contained were available to very few people. In the middle of the 15th century, a goldsmith named Johann Gutenberg came up with an invention that allowed books to be produced much more easily and cheaply than they ever had been before. While people often say that Gutenberg invented the printing press, that's a misconception. Gutenberg actually improved on a press that already existed. What Gutenberg did differently was to look at a page as an assembly of individual units, letters, numbers, spaces, and punctuation that make up words, sentences, and entire texts. Gutenberg reasoned that each of these individual units could be made into its own tiny stamp. These stamps could then be lined up to form specific texts, printed, and then taken apart and used again to print something different. Gutenberg's familiarity with metalworking led him to use lead, which was relatively cheap and widely available, to cast these tiny stamps. This invention is called movable type. Used in conjunction with Gutenberg's modified press, this is the invention that changed the world. Although printing made book production easier, it still took a great investment of time and materials, by our standards, to produce a book in the hand press period. All of those tiny pieces of type had to be lined up backwards by hand by people called compositors, skilled craftsmen who could read a copy of the text and choose the right letters in the right sequence. Compositors carefully built up pages letter by letter and line by line, then placed the pages of type into printing forms, which varied depending on the format of the book. Pressmen and their apprentices did the manual labor of printing the pages onto sheets of handmade paper. Here you're seeing an idea of what a Gutenberg press might have looked like. The finished sheets were folded, collated, and bound by hand by professional bookbinders. If this all seems somewhat similar to the process of creating a medieval book, it is, but with one important difference: the outcome. Instead of producing one book, this process created hundreds of nearly identical copies. This increased output had a tremendous impact on the availability of information. In fact, printing spread so rapidly throughout Europe that there were book printing operations recorded in more than 280 towns and cities by 1501, and they printed an estimated 20 million books during the first 50 years of printing. By that point, the book market was so saturated that the printing boom gave way to a printing bust, and many of the presses went out of business. We call books printed during this early period incunabula, a term derived from the Latin word for cradle, which refers to the idea that printing was in its infancy before 1501. With production so high in those early years, printers couldn't depend on expensive animal skin parchment to produce books. Instead, they favored paper, a much less expensive material made from recycled linen rags, flax, hemp, and other fibers. The long vegetable fibers they used created a strong, durable paper that is often still in good condition today. Its texture is more like that of paper money than the notebook or computer paper we write on currently. It's important to remember that printing and paper were not invented in Europe. Paper was used in China as a writing material starting in the 1st century CE. Printing on silk started in China in the 3rd century, and the earliest printed book that still survives to the present is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist holy text dated 868 CE. Printing and paper-making technologies gradually made their way west through trade networks and conquests. It took Europe almost 1,000 years to develop paper-making after it was practiced in China, and printing arrived about 700 to 800 years after it was well established in China and Korea. Contact with Arabic civilizations in Italy and Spain introduced paper to Europe in the 12th century. By the 13th century, the most productive paper mills were in Italy, and they supplied the rest of Europe well into the 16th century. You're looking at an illustration of Nuremberg's paper mill, which was founded in 1390 and was the first permanent paper factory north of the Alps. As this image shows, it didn't take long for printers to figure out how to combine images and text on the same page. This image is from one of the most famous incunables, the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was printed in 1493. Like this one, the earliest book illustrations were woodcuts, named because they were basically stamps that had been carved from a block of wood. In this image, everything white had to be cut away, leaving just the ridges of wood to print the lines of the design. It's a method called relief printing. Because movable type works the same way, woodcuts and type could be combined and printed all at the same time. Depending on the skill of the woodcutter, woodcut illustrations could be very crude or relatively detailed. The woodcuts in the Nuremberg Chronicle don't have a high level of detail, despite the fact that they were carried out by skilled artists. This is partially due to their small size, and partially due to the medium. Other than the drapery folds and cross-hatching for the shading, there isn't much information about texture or pattern in these images. How easy do you think it would be to create a garment based on these pictures? In scientific works such as this anatomy book by Andreas Vesalius, woodcuts were extremely detailed and also extremely expensive. It was hard to justify this level of expensive detail in illustrations of costume. However, by the middle of the 16th century, engraving, a method that allows finer details, had also become a popular form of book illustration. To make an engraving, an artist carves a design into a copper plate, the opposite of carving the white space away from a wooden block. This method is called intaglio printing. This is an example of a copper engraving plate. Copper is a fairly soft metal and it's easy to carve. To make a print, the copper plate is inked and the surface is wiped off. The ink stays in the grooves and it is printed onto a sheet of dampened paper with a rolling press. Engravings allow for a much higher degree of detail than woodcuts do. In this image, you can clearly see the lace on the lady's dress, the sheen of the silk, and the curls and feathers in her hair. Even the buttonholes on the gentleman's waistcoat are apparent. However, from the printer's point of view, there were drawbacks to using engravings. Engravings can't be printed at the same time as type. Engravings require a different kind of press, which is an additional investment in equipment for the printer. Engravings are also printed under greater pressure, which increases the wear and tear on the soft copper of the plate. This meant that the printer could get fewer prints out of one copper plate than he could out of one woodblock. Even so, for illustrations where detail mattered, copper engravings were a popular form of book illustration well into the 19th century because of the precision detail they offered. This German fashion magazine takes advantage of the medium to show off ruffles, pleats, and embroidered details that couldn't be conveyed in block printing. In most of Europe and the United States, printing technology did not change dramatically between the 16th century and the 1820s. However, by the middle of the 19th century, steam-powered printing presses appeared for the first time. Papermaking, bookbinding, and typesetting became automated. The time it took to produce a book, newspaper, or magazine issue decreased dramatically. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, books were still relatively expensive, and even newspapers and pamphlets were out of reach for the working classes. Industrialization changed that. Books were no longer expensive objects of craftsmanship. Instead, they became mass-produced commodities. The relative cheapness of printed materials in the 19th century is reflected in the new audiences publishers began to cater to: women and children. Women's magazines and illustrated children's books appeared in meaningful numbers for the first time less than 200 years ago. They were full of illustrations and advertising, and as demand for them increased, printers found new ways to create long-lasting illustration processes. The first, beginning in the 1820s, was steel engraving. Steel engraving incorporated a number of techniques that could be automated, and the printing plates were more durable than copper. This process was used in newspapers and especially in magazines, where widely circulated images of women reinforced new ideals of feminine beauty and made it easier for women to access images of the latest fashions. Have you heard the term fashion plate? We use that term because of the steel plates used to produce images like this one in the 19th century. The hard surface of the steel plate allowed for even finer detail than copper plate engravings, and steel engravers were able to use tiny hatch marks, dots, and contour lines to almost painterly effect. Steel engravings could not be produced in color, so magazine publishers employed entire offices full of colorists, many of whom were young girls. They worked long hours under less than ideal conditions to add predetermined colors to the pages of fashion magazines like this one. The use of color, combined with the heightened detail in steel engravings, allowed women to recreate the garments they saw in the magazines and fueled the spread of fashion. Another color printing process developed toward the end of the 19th century was chromolithography. Lithography is a process that uses water and oil resistance to transfer an image from the surface of a smooth limestone onto a piece of paper. It was expensive, but chromolithographs gained popularity around the end of the 19th century and appeared in advertising, children's books, and fine art publications as well. This tour through the history of printing shows how much our access to information has changed over 500 years. We're fortunate now to be living in another time of change. As our civilization shifts toward digital formats, it's useful to reflect on the ways that processes, materials, and media help to define the messages we receive.